Hi, I'm Scott. This is Goldwing Q&A Episode 3. You got questions, we got answers. Coming up next on GoldwingDocs. All right, I admit it, I'm cheating. I recorded this video immediately after recording the previous video, so I'm still wearing the same clothes. It's still snowy outside. Honestly, these Q&A videos are really easy to do because I don't have to come up with an idea. Basically, you guys write me the questions and I answer them. It's actually turned out to be really popular. People really like these videos. If you do have any questions you want answered, post them in the comments below, or of course, go onto the GoldwingDocs forum and you can post them there. So we have a question from Wing and a Prayer 13 from Sarasota, Florida. Why do our bikes have pneumatic suspension? What does it do? Okay, so that's easy. A pneumatic suspension basically means we have air. It's like we have an air compressor right here with buttons that allow us to increase or decrease the air pressure in the well, in some bikes in the front or the rear. The 1100 I used to have, you could actually direct it either to the front shocks or the rear shocks. On the 1500, it's just the rear shocks that have the air suspension. So the suspension has two aspects to it, the spring and the damping. The spring is what basically holds the bike up. So it's acting against the weight of the bike and it's holding it in place, but giving it a little bit of play so that when you impact a bump, it absorbs that energy, turning it into heat rather than transmitting it up into your back. However, springs are, well, springy, and you don't want to hit a bump and then have your wheel bouncing up and down the road, because that means when the wheel is bouncing up in the air, it's not on the ground contacting the ground and actually giving you grip or contact against the ground. So the suspension's job is not only to absorb those impacts, it's also to try to keep the wheel on the ground as much as possible. And the way that's done is with damping. So instead of having a spring that just resonates up and down and having the wheel bounce up and down the road, you have a piston that moves up and down, and it has oil. And oil is forced through tiny little orifices in that piston that regulates how quickly it can actually move. The damping is normally set up with valves that work differently depending on the direction the piston is moving. So when you impact a bump, it allows the oil to flow quickly through it so that the suspension can compress, absorbing the bump. However, on the extension, when the shock is expanding back out down to the ground, the orifices are much smaller. That means it slows down the speed slower than the resonant frequency of the spring, which is what the spring wants to do. It wants to do it at its own resonance frequency of the whole suspension system. So because it's slowing it below that resonant frequency, it just plants it back down to the ground and it more or less just stays there. Now, I'm sure you've seen suspension with broken dampers or no oil on a car driving down the road. And you'll see the wheel, it's kind of like bouncing up and down like crazy on the highway. That's a system that has a broken damper where the damper is no longer damping. So why do we have air in there? Well, the springs are set for specific weights. So you want to have correct amount of travel. You want to have the wheel at a certain height so that you have the most impact absorption so that you can absorb big bumps. But you also want to have the spring not too stiff, because if it's too stiff, now all those bumps are going up into the riders, and that's uncomfortable. So having that springiness in there is kind of a delicate balance. You can get around that somewhat with progressive springs, where you have coils that are tighter at one end of the springs, so those absorb the smaller bumps, and then the looser springs at the other end absorb the larger transitions. However, you still have it's only good for a certain weight that you're carrying on the bike. So some shocks have what's called preload, where it has a threaded ring. You can twist the ring and it will actually squeeze the spring a little bit more to give it preload, so it's in a little bit more tension, so that when you put a weight on the bike, it doesn't sag as much because it's already in tension. Well, that's good, but that it also lowers the amount of travel that the spring has. Instead, you can have pneumatic suspension, so that in addition to the spring, you can pump up the shock with air that gives a little bit of extra pressure in there, or resistance. So it's basically adding to your spring strength without changing the spring at all. So now, instead of just compressing the spring when you hit a bump, it's also compressing the air. And how much air resistance there is depends on how much pressure you put in. So when you have a passenger on the back and maybe some extra luggage in your trunk and you've got extra weight on your bike, you can compensate for that by increasing the pressure in your shocks to make it more resistant and more capable of carrying the heavy loads. And then when you don't have the heavy loads, you can reduce that air. So it's a nice way of giving yourself the best ride possible without actually having to get in there and adjust preload adjustments or anything of that sort. Now the 1500 from the factory has one shock that's actually a spring, and the other shock is just purely an air spring. And because they're both connected together at the swing arm, they work in parallel. A lot of us, like myself, have progressive 416 springs in here where you have a combination of spring and air shock on both sides. And that's how it was done back in the days of the 1100 and that sort of thing, when air suspension really debuted on the Goldwing. Okay, Indy Man from Indianapolis, Indiana says, my GL 1500 has started making a loud tapping noise on the right side. It used to go away when it warmed up, but now it's there all the time. And he posted a video that it sort of sounds like this. All right, well that's a fairly simple one. I know it sounds terrible, and the noise is coming from down here from the valve covers, and what that is your valve lash adjusters. So inside your engine you have valves on camshafts. So you have a camshaft with an eccentric lobe that rotates and pushes a rocker arm, and then that pushes down on the valves. Now the problem is that the amount of clearance in there is very critical. You don't want too little clearance, you get tapping. Too much clearance, it is even worse. You can actually have it so little clearance that the valves don't close entirely, and that means that when the engine is actually burning its charge, some of that charge can actually escape back up into the intake or exhaust manifold. You'll burn your valves. Valve lash, or your valve lash adjustment is critical. On the 1500s and the 1200s, that's actually done with hydraulics. So it uses engine oil pressure to pump up a tiny little hydraulic valve lash adjuster. And using that pressure, it gives it the correct amount of valve lash. And as things wear, it automatically accounts for that, and because it can actually adjust itself based on oil pressure. On the older Goldwings, the valve lash adjustment is manually done. So you take off the valve cover and you adjust each screw individually with a set of feeler gauges to give the exact right amount of clearance, and that's all you have to do. On the 1800, they switched to this horrible automotive style shim and bucket valve adjustment system that really, if you don't know what you're doing, you can really screw things up badly. I hate to say it, that's usually a place where you want to take it to a shop to get it done, because unless you've done that kind of shim and bucket adjustment before and you have the proper shims on hand to make those adjustments, the penalties for screwing it up can be really, really severe in terms of engine damage. So I know with GoldwingDocs we really encourage DIY, but this is one of those items that if you don't have experience doing it, take it to a professional. However, Indy Man here has this knocking noise coming from his 1500. There is no adjustment, so what's going on? Well, what happens is there are tiny little orifices in those hydraulic lash adjusters, and if you don't really change your engine oil like you should, you can get sludge buildup in those tiny little orifices. Now you've got sludge blocking those orifices, oil can't get in there to pump up the valve lash adjuster, and you have too much valve lash. And because you have too much valve lash, there's too much space in between the lash adjuster and the rocker arm. So instead of it pushing right up on there, it has a little space to accelerate, and that space means you get a tap noise every time it tries to actually move that rocker arm. The solution to this is actually fairly simple. Like always, seafoam. I wish I had a can here to demonstrate, but I don't, because I just used my last can to winterize my bike. So go to your local auto store or click on the Amazon link down below, get yourself a can of seafoam, pour it into your engine oil, run the bike gently. Don't go out running it on the highway at high speed or lugging the engine. You basically want to get that seafoam just to circulate through the oil. It's a solvent. It will clean out that sludge. Drain the engine oil immediately afterwards while it's still hot. You'll probably see clumps of sludge coming out. Fill it with clean oil. Most of the time, that's going to solve the problem. Sometimes you may have to do it twice. Anytime I've had to do this and I've had valve noise from clogged orifices on the hydraulic valve lash adjusters, one dose of seafoam typically fixes it. So give it a try. Hopefully that'll solve it for you. Cloud Seeker GA from Atlanta, Georgia. Yep, spent lots of time in Atlanta as well. My GL 1100 makes a loud noise like loose bolts inside the engine every time I accelerate. Okay, well, I know this one for sure. My 1100 used to do this as well. What you've got is a giant Hyvo chain. And what that is a multi-link chain, it's a metal chain that connects the engine to the transmission. Some other engines, the engine is lateral, they'll have a belt or sometimes even a gear drive connecting the engine to the transmission. The Goldwing engine is pointed longitudinally, so the crankshaft is this way and the transmission's underneath it. So they need a way of getting the power from the engine down to the transmission, and it's this giant chain. Now the tension of the chain has to be correct. You can't have too much tension because it'll bind up. You can't have too little tension or else you'll have too much free play. Generally, that Hyvo chain doesn't need maintenance. It doesn't need to be replaced. They don't typically fail or stretch. However, what does happen is that if you have irregular pulses from the individual cylinders, and by irregular, I mean some cylinders making more power than other cylinders, you get resonance in that Hyvo chain. So say your number one cylinder is making a little bit more power than the other three cylinders. That means every rotation of the engine, or actually every other rotation of the engine, you get an extra powerful pulse, and that can set up a resonance in the Hyvo chain depending on the engine speed. Now that resonance is far more likely to appear at low engine speeds. So if you lug the engine, say you're at low speed, you're in too high a gear, you open the throttle. So now the engine is making a lot of torque at very low speeds, and you've got one cylinder making more power than, say, the other three. Now you've got a perfect setup for that resonance to happen in the Hyvo chain. So it starts vibrating like crazy, and that's that horrible box of bolts sound that you hear coming from your engine. So two things you can do that. First off, don't lug your engine at low RPM. But secondly, you can balance your carburetors. And that's usually the cause of this, is unbalanced carburetors. So in your engine, you have 4 carburetors in your bike. This bike only has 2, but anytime you have more than one carburetor, you have to balance them so that they're all putting out the same amount of power. Otherwise, you have imbalance in between the cylinders. If you have a look at the GoldwingDocs forum, I'll put a link to it down below. We have how-to articles explaining how to balance your carburetors. It's not a tough thing to do. It takes a little bit of time. You do need a special tool, which I'll also link down below in the description, as well as in the article on the GoldwingDocs forum. And once you have your carburetors balanced, I'm sure you're going to notice a difference. The amount of vibration in your bike is going to be far less. It's going to be a nice, smooth ride, and you won't have that horrible box of bolts sound every time you accelerate. Well, I hope that's of some use to you. If you like what you saw here, please click like, subscribe, click that little bell so you get notified when we post a new video. Also, post a comment down below. If you like what you saw here, if you didn't like it, if you think I got something wrong, you think I forgot something, or if you have a question you'd like me to answer, please leave it in the comments below. And of course, don't forget to check the GoldwingDocs forum. Lots of friendly people there waiting to answer your questions or just say hi. Thanks for watching.